My name is Celeste, and I was 34 years old the afternoon I came home from work and my key no longer fit the lock. Not because the lock was broken. Because my brother had replaced it. While I was at my desk processing freight invoices 8 miles away, Raymond had driven to the hardware store, bought a new deadbolt, and installed it on the front door of the house I had lived in for 6 years while caring for our mother. He left a note on the door. It said, "Mom needs some space. We'll be in touch." I stood on that porch for a long time. I had my work bag on my shoulder and my keys in my hand, and the specific kind of stillness that comes when something happens that you knew somewhere was coming but didn't quite believe would arrive. What Raymond didn't know, what neither of my brothers knew, was that 2 years before that afternoon, our mother had sat down with her state attorney and added something to her will. One paragraph. Filed quietly, witnessed, notarized, and placed in a folder that her attorney kept in his office on Clement Street. She never mentioned it to anyone except me, and even to me she said only, "I've taken care of it, Celeste. Don't worry." By the time my brothers understood what she meant, it was too late to change anything. Welcome back to channel where quiet people let the documents do the talking. If you're new here, hit subscribe. A new story goes up every week and you will not want to miss what's coming. I want to tell you who I was before any of this happened because I think it matters. Not to make myself into something I'm not, but because the person you are going in shapes what you're capable of on the way out, and I want you to understand both. I grew up in Fresno, California, the middle child of 3. Raymond was 4 years older than me. My younger brother, Curtis, was 3 years behind. Our parents were Dolores and Frank Beaumont. Frank died when I was 19, a cardiac event, sudden, on a Wednesday morning before he'd even had his coffee. Our mother handled it the way she handled most things, without falling apart in front of anyone, then slowly, privately, over the years that followed. Dolores Beaumont was a woman who had worked as a medical billing specialist for 22 years and retired at 63 with a pension, a paid-off house, and the kind of institutional knowledge about insurance claims that made her, for most of my adult life, the person I called when anything involving paperwork felt uncertain. She had an eye for documents. She read everything. She kept files in a cabinet in the hallway with color-coded tabs, and she updated them every January without being reminded. She also had 2 bad hips, a tendency toward vertigo that had worsened in her early 70s, and a house on Mariposa Avenue that she had lived in since 1987. The house was not large, 3 bedrooms, a covered patio, a lemon tree in the backyard that my father had planted the first year they moved in, and that still produced more lemons than any one household could use. But it was paid off, and it was hers, and it sat in a neighborhood whose property values had risen steadily for a decade. Raymond lived in Sacramento. He worked in commercial real estate, not as an agent, but as a project coordinator for a mid-sized development firm. He had a good salary, a condo he'd bought in 2018, and a habit of framing every conversation about family property in terms of what made financial sense. He was not a bad person. I want to be careful to say that, because the story I'm about to tell you is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a man who looked at his mother's house and began, gradually, to think of it as a future asset rather than a present home. Curtis was 31 and lived 40 minutes from Fresno in a rental house with his girlfriend. He worked in landscape maintenance. Curtis was not the architect of what happened. That was Raymond. But he went along with it the way younger siblings sometimes do with older ones. Not because he was convinced, but because it was easier than being the one who objected. And then there was me. I had moved back to Fresno 6 years before the lock story begins. I want to be honest about why. It was not entirely altruistic. I had gone through a difficult end to a 5-year relationship. I had been living in an apartment in Bakersfield that I could afford but didn't love, and my mother had called me in March of that year to tell me she'd had a fall. Nothing broken. But she'd been on the floor for 40 minutes before she could get to her phone, and her voice when she told me had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. A kind of quiet acknowledgement that certain things had shifted. I moved into the back bedroom in June. I gave up my apartment lease, put my furniture in a storage unit, and drove my car north with 2 suitcases and a very clear understanding that this was indefinite. What I found when I arrived was a house that had been quietly slipping. Not dramatically, not the way neglect looks in photographs. But the small things, a gutter bracket that had pulled away from the fascia, a bathroom faucet that dripped in a specific rhythm, a section of the kitchen floor near the refrigerator that had developed a soft give underfoot that my mother had been ignoring for 2 years because she didn't want to bother anyone about it. I fixed the faucet myself the first week using a video on my phone and a parts kit from the hardware store. I called a contractor about the floor. I got the gutters assessed. My mother watched all of this from her chair at the kitchen table with an expression I can only describe as relief held very still, like something she didn't want to spill. I was working by then as a freight billing coordinator for a regional logistics company, the same job I've held for 9 years, the same one I drove to from that house every morning for 6 years. It is not a glamorous job. I process freight invoices, manage billing disputes, coordinate with carriers. I am precise and I am thorough, and I have never once in 9 years been late on a deadline. My manager, Teresa, has told me I am the person she would call if everything else broke, and I have taken that as the compliment it was meant to be. I paid my mother rent. I want that on the record. $400 a month, cash, first of every month, because I am not someone who lives in other people's houses for free and calls it help. My mother accepted it without argument, which surprised me at first, and then didn't because she was the kind of person who understood that allowing someone to contribute is its own form of respect. Raymond came to visit twice a year. Curtis came more often, he was closer, and he and my mother had an easy relationship that didn't require much planning. Neither of them helped with the house in any sustained way. Raymond hired a yard service for one summer, which I thought was generous, until I realized he had charged it to a joint account he'd set up with my mother for household expenses, without discussing it with her first. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed it. My mother and I didn't talk about the future much in those first 2 years. That was mutual and, I think, deliberate on both sides, she because she didn't want to confront the logistics of aging directly, and me because I had learned early that my mother moved toward hard things in her own time, and that pushing only produced resistance. But in the 3rd year, something shifted. She'd had a diagnosis, nothing terminal, nothing that changed her daily life immediately, but a cardiac condition that her doctor wanted monitored, that required a medication adjustment, and that had a way of making certain conversations harder to defer. She handled the diagnosis with the same composure she handled most things. She made the appointment, she got the prescription, she updated the color-coded file in the hallway cabinet, and she moved on. But that fall, she asked me to drive her to an appointment she didn't fully explain. I drove. The address was on Clement Street, a quiet block of professional offices near downtown. The sign on the door said Hargrove and Associates, Estate Planning. I sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes while my mother was inside. When she came out, she had her purse on her arm and a small manila envelope in her hand, which she tucked into her bag without comment. In the car, she said, "I've taken care of a few things. You don't need to worry." I said, "Okay." She said, "I've been meaning to do it for a while. It just seemed like a good time." I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't ask what she'd updated or changed. It was her business, and she would tell me what she wanted me to know when she wanted me to know it. On the drive back, she asked me to stop at the bakery on Van Ness. We got coffee and a piece of walnut cake each and sat at the window table and watched the street, and she told me about a woman she'd worked with in her billing days named Harriet who had retired to Portugal and sent a postcard every Christmas. She said she'd always thought Portugal seemed like a good idea. I said I thought so too. That was the closest we came, that afternoon, to discussing what had happened in the office on Clement Street. 3 months later, she mentioned it once more in passing. We were sitting on the covered patio in the evening and the lemon tree was doing what it did in October, heavy with fruit no one had picked yet, and she said, without preamble, "I added a codicil to the will. You know what a codicil is, with your billing background?" I said I did. She said, "Good. It's filed with Martin. That's my attorney, Martin Hargrove. He has everything." Then she looked at the lemon tree and said, "Raymond is going to have opinions about the house. He's been having them for a while. I want you to know that I have opinions too, and mine are the ones that are written down." I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "Don't okay, Mom me. I'm telling you something." I said, "I hear you." She nodded and looked back at the tree. That was the end of the conversation. I turned it over in my mind for weeks afterward. I didn't ask Martin Hargrove's name again. I had it. I didn't look up the office on Clement Street. I let it sit the way you let a thing sit when you understand it will be needed later, but cannot be used yet. What I didn't know, in the full sense of knowing, was what the codicil said. What it covered. How specific it was. My mother had given me the shape of it. I have opinions, and mine are the ones that are written down but not the contents. I went about my life. I went to work. I fixed what broke in the house. I drove my mother to her cardiac appointments and waited in the plastic chairs and drove her home. Raymond called in November that year and spoke to my mother for a long time. I was in the other room. Afterward, my mother came and found me in the kitchen and said, "Raymond wants to talk about the house." I said, "What does he want to say about it?" She said, "He thinks it would make financial sense to put it in a family trust. He says it would protect it." I said, "Protect it from what?" She said, without particular inflection, "He didn't specify." I looked at her. She looked back at me with those steady dark eyes of hers. Then she said, "I told him I'd think about it," and went to bed. She did not bring it up again. The following spring, my mother had a longer stretch in the hospital, not the cardiac condition directly, but a related complication, a fluid situation her doctor had been monitoring that required a 5-day admission. She came home with new instructions, a modified prescription schedule, and a visiting nurse who came twice a week for the first month. While she was in the hospital, Raymond drove down from Sacramento. I understood that. I didn't question it. He sat with her, he spoke with her doctors, or tried to, before the nursing staff redirected him to the patient advocate process, and he drove back Sunday evening. What I found out 2 weeks later was that during that visit, Raymond had also had a conversation with my mother that I was not present for and was not told about. I found out because Curtis mentioned it casually in a phone call under the apparent impression that I already knew. He said, "So now that Mom signed the paperwork Raymond brought, I guess the trust thing is moving forward." I said, "What paperwork?" A silence. Curtis said, "Raymond said you knew." I said, "Curtis, what paperwork?" He told me. Raymond had prepared documents for a family trust, not a will revision, not an addition, but a new trust structure that would place the house and several of my mother's financial accounts under joint trustee oversight. Raymond and Curtis as co-trustees. The documents named neither my mother as sole decision-maker going forward, nor me in any capacity. Curtis said, in the tone of someone who has realized mid-sentence that he has said too much, "I thought you knew, Celeste." I said, "I'm going to call you back." I went to my mother. She was in the living room in her chair with the television on low. I sat down across from her. I said, "Mom, can you tell me about the papers Raymond had you sign at the hospital?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said it was just a formality. For protection." I said, "Did you read them before you signed?" She said, very quietly, "I was tired, Celeste." I sat with that for a long moment. She said, "I know what I said on the patio. I haven't forgotten." She looked at the television, then back at me. "Call Martin." I called Martin Hargrove the next morning. I explained what I understood had happened. He asked me to come in. I drove to Clement Street on my lunch break and sat across from a man in his mid-60s with reading glasses and a careful manner, and he walked me through the situation with the directness of someone who has seen this particular sequence of events before and finds it neither surprising nor acceptable. The document my mother had signed was a trust amendment. It was not, Martin said, necessarily invalid, but it was potentially challengeable on grounds of undue influence given the circumstances of signing, and more importantly, it interacted in a specific and significant way with the codicil my mother had added 18 months earlier. The codicil, he explained, included a clause specifically addressing the disposition of the Mariposa Avenue property. The trust amendment, as drafted, would have superseded that clause, which was, Martin said, almost certainly the intent. He said, "Your mother came in 3 weeks ago. She'd already spoken with me before you called." He told me she had signed a document revoking the trust amendment. Witnessed and notarized.
Filed.
I said, "She came in 3 weeks ago?" He said, "The week after she got home from the hospital." I drove back to work. I sat at my desk and stared at my billing queue for a while. Then I got up and got a cup of coffee and came back and started working because I didn't know what else to do with that information yet. My mother never mentioned any of it to me directly. Not the revocation, not the visit to Martin's office. She just went on being herself, watching her evening programs, tending her African violets on the kitchen windowsill, asking me every Thursday whether I wanted chili or soup for the weekend. 2 months after that phone call with Curtis, on a Thursday morning in September, I went to work. I processed my invoices. I handled a dispute with a carrier in Dallas that had been dragging for 3 weeks. I ate my lunch at my desk. I drove home. My key did not fit the lock. I tried it twice. The lock barrel was new. You could see it, the bright, unweathered brass against the older paint around the plate. There was a note taped at eye level, folded once. I opened it. It said, in Raymond's handwriting, "Mom needs some space to figure things out without extra pressure. We think it's best if you find somewhere else for now. We'll be in touch when things settle down."
RC.
I stood on that porch for a long time. My phone had 3 bars. I called my mother's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called the house line. It rang and rang. I called my coworker, Priya. Priya Subramaniam had worked 2 desks away from me for 5 years. She was 41, practical, and in possession of a 2-bedroom apartment with a functional spare room. She answered on the second ring, heard approximately 30 seconds of what I said, and told me to come over. She said, "I'll make rice. Just come." I drove to Priya's apartment. I slept in her spare room that night with my work bag and the clothes I was wearing and a phone charger she lent me. I did not contact Raymond or Curtis. I did not go back to Mariposa Avenue. I called Martin Hargrove in the morning. I stayed at Priya's for 6 weeks. She had a futon in the spare room that she converted to a bed without being asked, and a bathroom with a shelf she cleared for my things within 48 hours of my arriving. She did not ask me to explain more than I wanted to explain. She made rice and dal, and occasionally a yogurt-based thing with cucumber that I started requesting specifically. She went to work beside me every morning without making it strange. I went home on my lunch breaks twice during those 6 weeks, when Raymond's car was not in the driveway, to collect additional clothing and my laptop and a few other things I needed. The second time, my mother was in the kitchen. She saw me and her mouth pressed together in a specific way. Not anger, something more complicated. I said, "I just need a few things." She said, "Celeste." I said, "It's okay, Mom." She said, "It is not okay." I said, "I know." We stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then I got what I came for and left. It was the only direct conversation we had during that period. I want to explain something about those 6 weeks that might not be obvious from the outside. I was not idle. I was not sitting on Priya's futon waiting for something to happen to me. I was working. I was making calls. I was sitting across from Martin Hargrove twice more during that period as he walked me through the full picture of my mother's estate documents, what existed, what it said, what the process would look like when the property eventually changed hands. The house on Mariposa Avenue was, at current assessed valuation, worth just over $480,000. That number sat in my mind like a stone, not because of what it meant for me, but because of what it clarified about why things had happened the way they had. A nearly $500,000 paid-off property in a neighborhood that had been appreciating steadily. 3 children. And a mother who had watched, carefully and without announcement, how each of those children had related to her over the years she had left. The codicil, Martin explained to me in our second meeting, was specific. It named me as the sole beneficiary of the Mariposa Avenue property. Not a split. Not a trust divided among the 3 of us. It also included a clause that Martin described as a protective directive, language specifying that in the event of any contested claim to the property, the burden of proof would rest with the contesting party and that the revocation my mother had filed superseded any subsequent instrument executed during a period of medical admission or recovery. My mother had not drafted that language at random. She had asked Martin to build it specifically, based on a conversation she'd told him she'd had with Raymond in November 2 years prior. The conversation about the family trust, the one where she'd said she'd think about it and then hadn't mentioned it again. She had known I understood sitting in that office for over 2 years, what the shape of this was. She had watched it develop. She had filed her response with the methodical, color-coded precision of a woman who spent 22 years processing insurance claims and understood exactly what documentation was worth. Martin said, in the measured way he said most things, "Your mother is a very organized person." I said, "She always has been." He said, "There will likely be a moment when this becomes relevant at a transaction level. When that happens, the documents speak clearly." I said, "What kind of transaction?" He told me that Raymond had, in the previous 3 weeks, retained a real estate attorney and was in early-stage discussions with a broker about listing the Mariposa Avenue property. He had apparently told the broker that the property would become available for listing once some family logistics were resolved. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Can they list it?" Martin said, "They can discuss listing it. They cannot close a sale without clear title. And clear title requires going through the documents that exist." He said, "The title officer at any closing will need to review the full estate file before transfer." He said, "Everything your mother has filed will be part of that review." I drove back to Priya's apartment that evening and sat at her kitchen table and told her the broad shape of things. Not the dollar figure. Not the legal specifics. Just, there's a document and it says what it says, and eventually someone is going to have to read it aloud in a room. Priya listened. She stirred her tea. She said, "And you just have to wait for that room." I said, "I just have to wait." She said, "Then we'll have Dal again tonight." We did. The call from Martin came on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, for weeks after I'd moved back into a studio apartment I'd found in the third week at Priya's, a place on Millbrook, small and sparse, but mine, with a lease in my name and a window that faced east, so I got the morning light. Martin said that the property at Mariposa Avenue had an accepted offer. The closing was scheduled for December 14th at a title company on Shaw Avenue. He said the title officer conducting the closing was named Robert Fenwick, someone Martin knew by professional reputation. He said, "Mr. Fenwick will have the full estate file before that meeting. Your mother's documents are in it." I said, "Will I need to be there?" He said, "You are named in the documents. It would be appropriate for you to be present." He said, "I'll be there as well." I wrote December 14th in my phone calendar. I requested the day off from work. I drove past the studio apartment's east window every morning for the next 3 weeks, watching the light change and not thinking about it more than I needed to. Raymond had not contacted me since the note on the door. Curtis had texted once, in October, to say he hoped I was okay. I had replied, "I'm okay. Thank you." That was the full extent of our communication. My mother had called me once, in early November, from what I recognized as a number I didn't have saved. I later understood it was Priya's landline that she'd found through her own research, which told me something about how determined she'd been to reach me without going through the house phone that Raymond might check. She said, "I want you to know I haven't sold anything." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Martin has everything." I said, "I know." She said, "Come see me when this is over." I said I would. December 14th arrived. I wore a dark green blazer I had not worn since a work presentation 2 years prior and drove to Shaw Avenue in the morning light. The title company occupied a suite on the second floor of a low building set back from the street, beige carpet, framed prints of California landscapes, a reception desk with a small Christmas wreath on the corner. I arrived 8 minutes early. Martin was already there in the small conference room off the hallway with his portfolio and his reading glasses. He stood when I came in and shook my hand and said, "Good morning." I sat in the chair he indicated, to his left, with my back to the window. Raymond arrived 4 minutes later with a man I didn't know, a younger man in a gray suit who turned out to be the real estate attorney he'd retained. Curtis came in behind them. Raymond saw me at the table and his expression moved through surprise and then recalibration and then a kind of controlled pleasantness. He said, "Celeste, I didn't know you'd be here." I said, "Good morning, Raymond." Curtis sat down quickly and looked at the table. Robert Fenwick came in last, carrying a folder and a legal pad. He was in his late 50s, methodical-looking, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has run hundreds of these closings. He introduced himself to the room, confirmed the property address, confirmed the parties present, and set his folder open in front of him. He said, "Before we proceed to the closing documents, I need to walk through the estate file, as there are instruments on record that affect the title transfer." Raymond's attorney leaned forward slightly. Raymond's posture, which had been composed, shifted in a way I felt more than saw. Robert Fenwick adjusted his reading glasses. He said, "I'll start with the codicil filed 18 months prior to today's date." The room went very quiet. Robert Fenwick read methodically. He identified the document by filing date, instrument type, and the name of the drafting attorney, Martin Hargrove, who was sitting 2 feet to my left and did not move. He stated that the codicil specifically named the property at Mariposa Avenue and its disposition. He read the relevant clause directly from the document, in the even, unhurried voice of a person reading a legal instrument, because that is his job and he will do it completely regardless of who is in the room. The clause named me, Celeste and Beaumont, sole beneficiary of the Mariposa Avenue property. With the protective directive intact, the language about contested claims and the burden of proof and the revocation of any instrument executed during medical admission or recovery. He read that clause too. He lowered the document and looked at the room over the top of his glasses. Raymond's attorney said something in a low voice to Raymond. Raymond's jaw had tightened in the particular way that a face tightens when it is working very hard to remain a face. He said, "There must be my mother signed a trust amendment. We have documentation." Robert Fenwick said, "I have that instrument as well." He leafed 1 page back in his folder. He said, "I also have the revocation, executed and notarized, dated 3 weeks after the trust amendment. The revocation was filed by your mother directly. It supersedes the amendment." Raymond said, "She didn't, she was." Martin Hargrove said quietly, "She was at home, Mr. Beaumont. In full capacity. With 2 witnesses present." He said it the way you state a fact that has already been established and does not require elaboration. Curtis had gone completely still. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a person who has been told a room is perfectly safe and is now reconsidering the architecture. Raymond's attorney murmured something again. Raymond pressed both palms flat on the table. He said, "I need a moment." Robert Fenwick said, with the same unhurried evenness, "Of course." He capped his pen. He waited. The moment stretched. Raymond's hands were still on the table. He was breathing carefully. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I looked at the California landscape print on the wall behind Robert Fenwick, and I thought about my mother at a window table at a bakery on Van Ness, eating walnut cake, saying she'd always thought Portugal seemed like a good idea. After a long pause, Robert Fenwick said, "The title cannot transfer to a buyer without resolution of the beneficiary designation on record. As the named beneficiary, Ms. Beaumont would need to be party to any sale of the property." Raymond looked at me. It was the first time he had looked at me directly since I'd walked in. His expression had moved through its several stages and arrived somewhere that was not anger, not quite, more like the specific stillness of a person who has been running a calculation for a long time and has finally arrived at a result they cannot argue with. I said calmly, "We can talk about what makes sense." Those were the only words I said in that room about any of it. Raymond looked back at the table. His attorney made a note on his legal pad. Robert Fenwick reopened his folder and said, "Let's discuss the procedural steps." The closing did not complete that day. Robert Fenwick walked the room through what would need to happen: my written consent as named beneficiary, an amended purchase agreement, a revised closing timeline. He was methodical and neutral throughout, the way a river is neutral, not taking sides, just moving in the direction things are pointed. Raymond and his attorney left 40 minutes into the procedural discussion to make calls. Curtis stayed. He sat at the table after they walked out and he looked at me and he said, "I didn't know about the codicil." I said, "I know." He said, "I really didn't." I said, "Curtis, I know." He nodded and looked at his hands. He said, "I went along with what Raymond said about you needing to leave." He didn't offer it as an excuse. He said it the way you say something when you're not looking for absolution, just acknowledgement. I said, I know that too. He nodded again. Martin had stepped out to take a call, and we sat in the beige conference room with the California landscapes and the small Christmas wreath visible through the door, and I let the silence be what it was, because not every moment needs to be filled. The first call from Raymond came that same evening, to my cell, which I had not changed, and which he apparently still had. I let it go to voicemail. The message was careful, composed in the register of a man who has spoken with an attorney about what to say and how to say it. He said he wanted to discuss the situation. He said he thought there might be a way to handle this that worked for everyone. He said family mattered more than property. I sat with that message for a day. Then I called Martin and asked him what my options were. Martin walked me through them. I could consent to the sale and receive the proceeds as the named beneficiary, which at the current offer price would yield a figure I will not state directly except to say it was in the range the property's assessed value suggested. I could decline to consent, and the sale would not proceed. I could propose a different arrangement. Any of these were mine to choose. I said, "What does my mother want?" Martin said, "She wants you to have what she set aside for you. She told me that specifically." He paused. She also said, and I'm quoting, that she'd like you and your brothers to find a way to be in the same room someday. But that's separate. I thought about that for a long time. I consented to the sale. I signed the amended agreement. The closing completed 12 days later, on a Friday morning, without incident. Robert Fenwick read the instruments, the parties signed, the title transferred cleanly. I sat at that table with Martin beside me, and I signed my name in the places he indicated, and I did not gloat, and I did not make a speech, and I did not look at Raymond when his attorney whispered something to him that made his face go briefly unreadable. The funds, once processed, arrived in the account Martin had helped me establish. I paid off the remaining balance on my car. I put the rest in a money market account, and I did not touch it for 3 months because I needed to think about what it meant, and I didn't want to make a single decision out of the specific vertigo of having it. Raymond called twice more over the following month. The first call I took briefly. He said, "I want you to know I wasn't trying to cut you out." I said, I believe you thought you were making a good decision." He was quiet. I said, "I don't think you should call again for a while." He said, "Okay." And didn't. Curtis texted me on Christmas morning, "Merry Christmas, Celeste. I hope you're okay." I wrote back, "Merry Christmas.
I'm okay."
I meant it. My mother called me December 28th. She said, "Come for New Year's." I drove to Mariposa Avenue. The property's new owners would not take possession until February, and we sat on the covered patio in the winter light, the lemon tree bare now, its branches holding the cold and the gray, and she made coffee, and we did not talk about any of it at all. We talked about Portugal. We talked about Harold. She asked about the studio on Millbrook, and I told her about the east-facing window and the morning light, and she said that sounded like exactly what I needed. I moved her into a 2-bedroom apartment in March that she chose herself, in a building with an elevator and a courtyard with a fountain, for miles from where I live. I drive there on Sundays. We have coffee. Sometimes we take the walnut cake from the bakery on Van Ness. Priya texted me last week a picture of a citrus tree she'd found at a garden center. She said she was going to try to grow it on her apartment balcony, and asked if I had advice. I told her it needed more sun than most people think. She said she'd find the sunniest spot she had. I've thought a lot in the months since that conference room on Shaw Avenue about what my mother actually did. She didn't fight. She didn't confront Raymond when he brought those documents to her hospital room. She didn't call a family meeting or issue ultimatums or make anyone choose sides. She sat in her chair by the African violets and she watched the shape of things, and she went, on a quiet afternoon, to an office on Clement Street, and she wrote down what she wanted with the same precision she had brought to 22 years of insurance billing. She made a document. She filed it. She waited. There is a kind of patience that gets mistaken for passivity. It looks like yielding. It looks like someone who has stopped caring or given up. But it is not yielding. It is the patience of a person who knows that the structure underneath is already built, who has done the work before the crisis so that when the crisis arrives, there is nothing left to do but let the paperwork speak. My mother spent her whole working life understanding that the document in the file is the thing that settles the question. Not the louder voice at the table. Not the one who moves fastest or acts most decisively in the moment. The document. The one you took the time to make correctly, with witnesses, with a notary, with an attorney who kept a copy in his office safe. She knew that. She had always known that. She just waited until the moment when knowing it mattered. That's my story. A note taped to a lock that had already been changed, a conference room on Shaw Avenue, and a lemon tree that still gives more fruit than any one household can use. I want to ask you something before you go. Has someone you love ever protected you with a quiet action, something they did without telling you, that you only found out about later when it was already done? A parent, a grandparent, anyone, someone who filed the paperwork before the problem arrived.
Tell me about it.
Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.